Imagine it's Saturday morning, 1998, you've got a tenner in your pocket, a bowl of sugar puffs in your belly, and you're heading down to the local market with your dad. You aren't there for the knockoff tracksuit or a giant bowl of fruit for £1. You're heading to the back corner, to the man with the folding wallpaper table and a heavy-duty CD binder. In the 90s, the official PlayStation experience was a genuine luxury. 50 quid for a single game, in that economy, you've got to be joking. While the kids in the fancy suburbs were peeling off the cellophane of a mint condition Final Fantasy VII, we were staring at a spindle of silver verbatim discs with the titles scribbled on in blue Sharpie. But there's a catch. You couldn't just pop these in and play. You needed the magic. You needed to know a guy named Dave who worked out of a smoke-filled garage and claimed he could chip your console for 20 quid. It felt like an underground resistance. You'd hand over your grey box, pray you were about to be scammed, and 24 hours later, you'd get a machine back that suddenly read the entire world's library. This wasn't just about being cheap. This was a cultural rebellion. The mod chip turned the PlayStation from a high-end Sony gadget into a people's console. It's the reason your nan had Crash Bandicoot and your cousin had 400 games, but you didn't own a single manual. Today, we're looking at the illegal, soldering iron-fueled underground that technically shouldn't exist, but without it, the PlayStation might never have become the king. Welcome to the Index Archives. I'm Parasine. Today we aren't looking at the pristine black label gems sitting in a collector's vault. Today we're heading into the long grass to the world of the Shadow Library. If you grew up in the 90s, especially in a place where 50 quid was better spent on the electric meter than a copy of Tekken 3, you know exactly what I'm talking about. We're talking about the mod chip. A tiny sliver of silicon that turned a legitimate Sony product into a digital Wild West. This wasn't just about saving a few quid, it was about an entire underground economy. It was a time when your local dealer didn't sell anything illegal except chipped consoles and spindles of copied discs. It's a story of garage engineers, Market Dave, and the constant low-level fear that your PlayStation was about to explode because some guy with a shaky hand and a soldering iron had been poking around its insides. But here's the kicker. As much as Sony hated it, the mod chip might be the very thing that won them the war. It turned the PlayStation into a console for everyone. It made the library accessible to the masses, not just the kids with the big houses. Today, we're cracking open the shell to see how the Silver Disc Syndicate changed gaming forever, how Sony tried to kill it with the red screen of death, and why we still have a weird nostalgic love for those blue marker labels. Let's talk about the cold hard cash. In the mid to late 90s, the price of a brand new AAA PlayStation game was usually hovering around the £44.99 to £49.99 mark. Adjust that for inflation today, and you're looking at nearly 80 quid. For a kid in a working class town, 50 quid wasn't just pocket money, it was a fortune. It was the kind of money that required a formal presentation to your parents, promising you'd wash the car every Sunday for a year just to get your hands on Resident Evil 2. I distinctively remember holding on to me pocket money off me mum, me nan, and working me paper round just to gather a few quid together to get me next game. The industry at the time felt like an exclusive club, and if you didn't have the membership fee, you were left staring at the back of a box in Woolworths like a character out of a Dickens novel. Sony had moved us away from the cheap, chunky plastic of the 8-bit era and into this sleek world of the CD-ROM. They told us it was the future, but they forgot to mention that the future came with a hefty price tag. This was the 50 quid barrier. And for a lot of us, it was a wall we simply couldn't climb. This is where the silver disc started to look less like a crime and more like a public service. When Market Dave tells you he can give you Ridge Racer Type 4, Metal Gear Solid and Silent Hill for a tenner total, your moral compass doesn't just spin, it breaks. It changed the math of childhood. Suddenly, you weren't choosing one game for Christmas and one for your birthday. You were building a library that would make a shop manager weep. But it changed how we played too. When you've only got one game, You squeezed every drop of life out of it, you find every secret, but when you've got a spindle of 50 pirate discs, you become a digital glutton. You play the first level, get bored, and swap the disc. The 50 quid barrier had been smashed, but in its place was a mountain of plastic that we barely appreciate because it felt so easy. The stakes were gone, replaced by the hum and sound of a copied disc and the smell of a cheap inkjet printer.
He's on his last legs. Ow, he just needs to stay on his feet. Down.
Now, you might be wondering how Sony, a multi-million pound tech giant, was getting outsmarted by a guy named Steve in a damp shed. It all came down to something called the Wobble Groove. See, Sony knew that people would try to copy these discs as soon as they realised they were just standard CDs. To stop them, they didn't just put data on the disc. They physically altered how the disc was pressed. They made the laser track wobble at a very specific frequency that a standard home CD writer simply couldn't replicate. When you popped a disc in your PS1, the first thing the laserdisc did was look for that wobble. It was like a digital secret handshake. If the laser felt the wobble, it said, right, you're a real Sony disc, carry on. If it didn't, you got the dreaded, please insert PlayStation format disc screen, the universal sign that you'd been caught. Your PC at home could copy the data perfectly, but it couldn't copy the physical shiver of the plastic. This is where the mod chip comes in, and honestly, it's a bit of a genius move. The chip wasn't some massive supercomputer, it was a tiny piece of logic that sat inside your console like a double agent. It didn't try to make the pirate disc wobble. Instead, it waited for the laser to ask, is there a wobble here? And then the chip would shout, yeah, definitely, don't worry about it. It injected the handshake signal directly into the console's brain, bypassing the physical check entirely. It was a total hoodwink. The console thought it was playing a pristine black label copy of Gran Turismo, while in reality, it was struggling to read a scratched up Maxell disc that had been sitting at the bottom of a backpack for 3 weeks. This tiny bit of bypass surgery turned every PlayStation into a universal player. It didn't care about the region locks or the wobble grooves. It was the ultimate I know a guy solution to a high-tech problem, and once that secret was out, there was no going back. Getting your console chipped wasn't like taking your car for a service at a main dealer. There was no waiting room with a coffee machine or a glossy brochure. Instead, it usually involved a whispered conversation at school or down the pub, followed by a trip to a semi-detached house in a part of a town your mum probably told you to avoid. You'd knock on the door, and a guy, let's call him Solder Iron Steve, would lead you into a garage that smelled exclusively of damp cardboard, stale tobacco and burnt flux. This was the front line of the 32-bit revolution. Steve would clear a space on a workbench covered in half-strip VCRs and broken toasters, flip your pride and joy onto its lid, and start going at it with a screwdriver. Watching a stranger crack open your PlayStation was a traumatic experience. It felt like watching open heart surgery being performed by a man who'd just finished a bacon sandwich. One slip of the wrist and your console was a very expensive paperweight. The actual chip was tiny, sometimes just 8 pins, but the soldering was an art form. You'd watch as he'd bridge connections on the motherboard with wires so thin they looked like spider silk. If he was a professional, it was neat and tidy. If he was an amateur, it looked like a bird's nest in there. You'd hand over 20 quid, he'd pop a silver copy of Tekken 3 to test it, and when that Namco logo appeared, the relief was better than anything. You walked out of that garage feeling like you'd just pulled off a heist, clutching a grey box that now held the keys to the kingdom. There was a very specific look to a bootleg library that you just don't see in the digital age. When you walked into a friend's house and saw a stack of official games, it looked like a curated museum. All those lovely black spines lined up like soldiers. But when you walked into a pirate's den, it was a chaotic mess of silver discs. These weren't the classy pitch black CDs Sony produced. These were bottom shelf CDRs with names like Verbatim, TDK or Maxell embezzled across the top. The artwork was the real tragedy. If you were lucky, the guy at the market had a decent inkjet printer and he'd give you a blurry, pixelated scan of a front cover that looked like it had been pulled out of a puzzle. Most of the time though, you got nothing. You just got a bare disc with a title scrolled across the top in blue or black Sharpie. There's something uniquely 90s about seeing the words Crash Bandicoot spelt wrong written in the shaky handwriting of a man who clearly hadn't slept since the Modchips was invented. No manual, no back cover, just a slimline dual case that cracked if you breathed on it too hard. It felt bootleg because it was. You missed out on the lore and the controller layouts. But honestly, we didn't care. We were too busy marvelling at the fact that our spindle of 20 discs cost less than a round of drinks. It was a library of ghosts, unbranded, unofficial, but entirely more exciting because it felt like you were getting away with something every time you pressed power. If the garage was the surgery, the local market was the retail front. Every Saturday morning, the air thick with the smell of cheap burgers and laundry detergent, the game man was the main event. He didn't have a shop. He had a folding wallpaper table and a heavy-duty ring binder that felt like it weighed a ton. You'd stand there in the drizzle, flicking through the plastic sleeves filled with photocopied covers like you were browsing a forbidden text. It was a brilliant, if slightly dodgy business model. You'd pick your titles and he'd reach under the table into a literal bin bag full of unlabelled discs. He knew exactly where everything was by some sort of dark magic. 2 for a tenner or 3 for 13. It was the only place on earth where FIFA and Final Fantasy had the exact same value. There was no RRP here, only the market price. The level of customer service was surprisingly high too. If a disc didn't boot, you'd bring it back the next week and he'd swap it out without a word, rubbing it on his jumper to clean it before handing you a new one. He was a pillar of the community, really a digital Robin Hood in a puffer jacket. He wasn't just selling data, he was selling the dream of the 1278 library to kids who otherwise would have been stuck playing the Demo 1 disc until their thumbs bled. It was the Shadow Index in physical form.
I'm sorry, Spyro, but you seem to be playing a hacked version of this game. This may be an illegal copy. Since this copy has been modified, you may experience problems that would not occur on a legal copy.
By the year 2000, Sony was fed up with being the world's most pirated punching bag. They'd tried the Wobble Groove, and we'd bypassed it. They tried the regional lockouts, and we'd soldered them into oblivion. So for Spyro Year of the Dragon, they decided to stop playing fair and started playing psychological games. This wasn't just anti-piracy, it was the ultimate developer troll. Insomniac Games packed the codes with checkpoints. The game would let you boot up just fine, but then it would start gaslighting you. You'd start flying through a level, and suddenly your gems would just vanish. Then a character would pop up and tell you that your save file had been deleted for your own protection. It was genius. They let you taste the game just long enough to get hooked before pulling the rug out from under you. If you were playing a silver disc copy, the game became a nightmare. Zoe the Fairy would appear and tell you that your version of the game was illegal, and eventually, the game would just stop you from finishing it entirely. It was the first time we realised that the software itself was awake. You'd run back to the market guy complaining that the purple dragon was broken, and he'd just shrug. Even the garage engineers hadn't figured out how to fix a game that was actively making fun of you. It was the red screen of death for your heart, and it proved that Sony was finally ready to fight dirty. There is no greater testament to the DIY ingenuity of the 90s than the sight of a multi-million-pound piece of Japanese hardware sitting propped up on 2 VHS tapes, completely upside down, just to play a copy of V-Rally. See, those silver discs we were buying weren't made of the same high-quality material as the official black bottom discs. They were heavier, they were off balance, and they were noisy. They put a massive amount of strain on the PS1's plastic laser assembly, which, to be fair to Sony, was about as sturdy as a wet biscuit. Over time, the heat from the console would warp the plastic rails, causing the lasers to sag. Suddenly, your pirate copies would start stuttering, the FMV cutscenes would skip like a scratch record, and the music would cut out right at the climax of a boss fight. But did we send them back to Sony for professional repair? Of course not. We discovered console physics. We realised that if you flipped the PlayStation onto its back, gravity would pull the laser back into the correct alignment. It looked absolutely ridiculous. A console with its belly in the air, wires tangled everywhere. But it worked. Some people took it further, propping up one side at an angle or putting a heavy book on the lid to stop the wobble. We weren't just gamers anymore, we were amateur mechanical engineers. You'd be sitting there in your room, praying the laser wouldn't give up the ghost before you reached the save point, listening to the disc spin with a sound like a jet engine taking off. It was the physical cost of the Shadow library, the moment we realised that getting games for a few pounds came with a very real expiration date on our hardware. Now, here's where the story gets a bit more sophisticated. While most of us were using Modchips to save a few pounds on Dino Crisis, there was a smaller, more dedicated group of gamers using them for a much nobler cause: the import. See, the PS1 was the king of the regional lockout. If you had a UK console, you were stuck in the PAL graveyard, 50Hz borders that made the games run 17% slower, and a library that missed out on some of the absolute best titles Japan and America had to offer. For the serious RPG fans, the mod chip wasn't a tool for piracy, it was a tool for liberation. It was the only way to play the legends like Xenogears or Chrono Cross, games that Sony, in their infinite wisdom, decided the British public didn't want to see. The chip didn't just bypass the Wobble Groove, it bypassed the NTSC vs PAL Border Patrol. Suddenly, your grey box was a passport to the world. You would head to the back of the specialised gaming magazine and find the import shops that would sell you the legitimate high-quality Japanese or US versions of games. They were expensive, they were in a different language, and you needed a special converter cable just to stop the screen from flickering in black and white, but it felt like you were part of an elite club. You were seeing the real PlayStation library, the one the 1278 count tried to hide from us. The mod chip accidentally became the ultimate tool for game preservation. It proved that gamers didn't want borders, we just wanted to play the best stuff no matter where it came from. You can't have a digital heist on this scale without the bosses in suits noticing. The Silver Disc Syndicate didn't just fade away, it left a massive, jagged scar on the industry that we're still feeling today. Sony, Nintendo and Sega watched their profit margins get chewed up by market stalls and spindles of verbatims, and they decided, never again. If you'd ever wonder why your modern console feels less like a toy and more like a high security prison, you can thank the mod chip era. This was the birth of the aggressive DRM world. The PS1 piracy war is the reason we eventually got always online requirements, non-transferable digital licenses, and consoles that need a 5GB update just to let you look at the menu. The industry moved away from physical wobbly grooves and into a world of digital handshakes that happen every few seconds over your Wi-Fi. They realised that if the game is on a disc, someone will try to trick the laser, but if the game lives on a server in California, you've got no chance. It also changed how developers looked at us, the players. In the 90s, they trusted us with a disc and a manual. Now they treat us like potential shoplifters. The freedom of the Shadow library came with a hidden price: the death of true physical ownership. We might have won the battle for cheap games in 1998, but we lost the war of the people's console. The wide open frontier of the 32-bit era was fenced off, paved over, and turned into a subscription service where you didn't own anything. You just rent it until the servers go dark. So there you have it, the Shadow library. A world of blue sharpies, garage door surgeries, and consoles sitting upside down on a copy of the morning newspaper. It was a chaotic, lawless and brilliant era that defined the PlayStation experience for millions of us. While the official index tells one story of 1,278 retail releases, the reality for the kid on the street was a spindle of £5 silvers that unlocked everything from Silent Hill to Street Fighter. Did piracy kill the industry? Hardly. If anything, it turned the PS1 into an unstoppable juggernaut. It made the console part of the furniture in every house, from the high-rises to the leafy suburbs. It was the people's console, because it was the one that let you outsmart the system just enough to feel like you were winning. We might be living in a world of digital locks and always online requirements now, but they can't take away those Saturday mornings at the market. The Modchip was a bit of technical magic, and it gave us the keys to the kingdom when we were too broke to afford the entrance fee.